Good morning, everyone. All right, so good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to each and every one of you here today for the 2024 Matthews Faculty Fellowship Symposium. To begin, let us acknowledge that Queens is situated on the traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. To acknowledge this traditional territory is to recognize its longer history, one predating the establishment of the earliest European colonies. It is also to acknowledge this territory's significance for the Indigenous peoples who lived and continue to live upon it and whose practices and spiritualities were tied to the land and continue to develop in relationship to the territory and its other inhabitants today. We are grateful to be able to live, learn, and play on these lands. My name is Eden, and I'm joined here by my colleague Coco. We are the Policy Talks representative for the MPA class and the creators of today's conference. Today we will be hosting our symposium made possible by the visionary support of the Donald Matthews Lecture Series, a cornerstone of the Matthews Faculty Fellowship in Global Public Policy. Established by Donald Matthews in 2006, this endowment supports the appointment of world-class leading-edge scholars and practitioners who teach, lead research, and share their experience with students and faculty at Queen's University. As we embark on this day's proceedings, let us honor and celebrate the legacy of Donald Matthews, a true Canadian leader whose life's work was deeply rooted in the spirit of public service.
We are excited to present our first keynote speaker to begin off the day for today. So, with a distinguished career spanning over 25 years in the Canadian Federal Public Service, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Al Sutherland as our symposium's keynote speaker today. Al was appointed as his Assistant Secretary to the Cabinet, Machinery of Government, within the Government of Canada's Privy Council office in May 2014. He provides advice to the Prime Minister on the structure and organization of government, including cabinet decision-making processes, relations with the King and the Governor General, their interpretation and application of constitutional principles and conventions that underpin responsible government, protecting democracy from mis- and disinformation, the effective functioning of democratic institutions, and the roles and responsibilities of ministers. So prior to his appointment, he was the Assistant Deputy Minister to the Learning Branch at ESDC. As a public servant, Al has held policy, planning, and research positions in the Privy Council's office, the Policy Research Initiative, the Department of Global Affairs, the Department of Innovation, Science, and Economic Development. He holds a degree at John F. Kennedy's School of Government, Harvard University, and Queen's University, where he was a recipient of the Gold Medal in Political Studies. So he's number one in his class. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Mr. Al Sutherland.
I guess we'll see whether I still remember anything from those days. Thank you very much, Coco. Thanks very much, Eden. When they first approached me, I was thrilled with the idea. I did wonder if you'd done your due diligence. I'm in Machinery of Government. Machinery of Government doesn't get out very often, and you may learn why pretty soon. We are generally seen as folks who hold to the true faith of the Westminster system, who are normally thought of in kind of monkish terms, looking at old tomes dating back to the Magna Carta. Now, I'm going to try and do something a little bit different. I did see this as a chance to reflect on government in an interesting way. I'm someone, and it'll become clear to you, I'm someone who believes in institutions. Queen's is an important institution. It's been important to me personally. And it's also important to me in my job because I have former MPA students who are important members of my team. So I'm also someone who hires from the MPA program. Maybe not directly. We usually require a little bit of government experience before we bring people on, but we do look for the talent that that we've found has come from MPA students. I'm also delighted, I was further delighted that Margaret Biggs would be with me in the panel. I worked for Margaret when she was known as the queen of the cabinet process, as DepSec at Priorities and Planning. And Margaret, you too will see Whether or not I captured some of your lessons, I certainly learned an awful lot from you, so I'm delighted to see you. And also, I was surprised to see Keith Banting. He may take my gold medal away from me after this presentation, I don't know. All right, so let's get started. So I thought I would start with a little bit about what is PCO and why am I here? Why is this potentially of interest to you? PCO are the public servants who serve the Prime Minister. We're normally seen as guardians of the cabinet process, gatekeepers sometimes, but also we are directly providing policy advice to the PM. This is the best definition of PCO that I've found. It's from Gordon Robertson, a former clerk or head of the public service, dating back to 1971, and it's with reference to PMO. It's with reference to our twin organization, PMO. So let me just read bits of it. So whereas PMO is partisan, politically oriented, yet operationally sensitive, PCO, the balance is different, right? It's nonpartisan, I would add professional and operationally oriented, but you have to be politically sensitive. There's no point putting the advice that just is not going to fly in the political context that the Prime Minister and his government or her government find themselves. There's an extra little bit, which is that the sharing of information between PMO and PCO, the important term here is if it is relevant and needed for its work. And here is my first reference to Margaret Biggs. You will know this one. The mixing of the fresh water and the salt water was something she drilled into our heads for many years. Fresh water is the Privy Council office. Salt water is PMO. Too much mixing and you dilute the advice. Too much mixing and you get something brackish. And the other thing that's a real challenge in the relationship between the two organizations is that it disintermediates senior levels. So if the deal is cut between lower levels of PCO and PMO, there's no opportunity for the senior levels to weigh in properly, either from PMO or PCO. So that's an extra danger. So that's why Margaret's caution to us, and it's one that lives on today, is that our advice, the best advice is a clear stream of public service advice and a clear stream of political advice. PM gets to decide, and that's how the system works within the Privy Council office at its best. So let me just tell you a little bit about machinery of government. So when I'm talking to folks in the public service, I generally call this my apology slide because these are some of the ways we impact other parts of government. We have a big role in transition. The Caretaker Convention, which is a very important tradition within the Canadian public service that ensures the nonpartisanship of the Canadian public service during times of election, is something created within machinery. It was made public by Prime Minister Harper. It was an excellent development and one that I think has helped reinforce that convention, given it so it's understood throughout the public service and has important implications in ensuring that transitions can be efficient and effective, and that the public service is able to start demonstrating its value in a nonpartisan way to an incoming government of whatever stripe. Second thing is mandate letters, which I have to apologize a lot for in recent years. So you may know that Prime Minister Trudeau has mandate letters to his entire ministry, some 760 odd promises and commitments, and that's something that comes out of MOG. A third area is and this is really the kind of core machinery power, is the creation, winding up, or merger of different government organizations. There's a very old phrase or saying that goes that when MOG works late, Ottawa trembles. And the reason for that is because we have, in providing advice to the Prime Minister under his machinery prerogative, we have the ability to make substantial changes to government organizations, and from time to time it does happen. Cabinet is another area of focus for us. Cabinet papers, a very interesting part of that. The memorandum to Cabinet. What is the information that needs to come before ministers to help inform good decision making? That's something that Cabinet papers are a machinery responsibility. I would be very remiss if I didn't talk about the Canadian Secretary to the King, who works in machinery and is responsible for ensuring close ties between the Government of Canada and the King. And finally, we have our external assurance providers. This one is less obvious, but we have substantial relations with the Auditor General. Auditor General isn't always popular in Ottawa, but we're big fans of the Auditor General in machinery. The reason the Auditor General isn't popular in Ottawa generally is that the AG is a bit like an alarm clock. You actually don't like to hear it, but you need to hear it. And we like the Auditor General because she points to problems in government and helps improve governance in the long term. So that's who I am. I had a great conversation with Edmund and Coco about what I would talk to you today, and I decided I'd talk to you about stuff I know. So we're going to talk to you about issues around trusting government, which has been a growing issue recently, and also institutions, prime ministers, and processes. And what I'm trying to do is perhaps to give you some approaches to these issues that might be a little different than you may have heard. So a bit of a practitioner's view on each of those things. So let me just get my slide here. So trusting government. So what do we want to say about that? There's an old joke about trusting government. It goes something like this. How do you get Canadians to get out of the pool? You say, hey, Canadians, get out of the pool. Now that's a statement about how Canadians are rule followers, how they have a general trust in our system, and I'm not sure it applies anymore. I think we've moved on from that step. There's no doubt that within the public service, we are facing some real challenges in earning and re-earning the trust of Canadians. You can see it in the Arrive Can, you can see it in Phoenix, you can see it in some of the contracting in national defense. COVID response has been a challenging one. So in each of those areas, there have been challenges in the area of trust. And you may think that trusting government is ill-advised. What I'd like to present to you is why it's so important to our society and why, as public servants, we have to work very hard to maintain, re-earn, and expand that trust. So, this is a saying from the Netherlands about trust arriving on foot and leaving on horseback. It's a proverb. What it basically is saying that it is slow to gain, we are slow to gain trust, and you can lose it very quickly. So that's the essential dilemma. By the way, issues around trust are not unique to Canada, and that's something that we have seen throughout the OECD. But let me just show you Canada in comparative perspective. So this is to show that I have some academic rigor. I'd like to point out two things for this slide. The first is that it's a long-term decline. So if you look at the left-hand side, you see a long-term decline in trust levels. And that, we actually track fairly close to the United States using the ECOS survey. The other thing I would point out is in the middle graph, the 59 in 2020-21. It's a local maximum. And I'll return to that later. The slides will be available if you want to check my data. Let me give you some more data. So the first thing I would note that in comparative perspective, Canada scores pretty well. So maybe the pool analogy continues to hold. Canadians are trusting and will follow government direction. On the right-hand side, you have some data from the OECD. I'd point out two things about it. First, that the OECD is looking at trust in a sustained and serious way. This survey that from 2021, I think it is, had 23 countries involved. First time ever that the OECD has looked at trust as part of its reinforcing democracy series, which is another thing that I would point out to you. They're doing the second series. They've already been in the field. The data will come out in the next 2 or 3 months. And there are 30 countries involved, and including, very importantly, the United States. It'll be very interesting to see their data. The data is currently under embargo. I would tell you I'm not losing any sleep over it. So if we look at the 2022 data, I would note that Canada does fairly well, above the OECD average, generally speaking, and there's some reason for hope. But machinery is not about hope. Here are some reasons to be concerned and some reasons for losing of sleep, and that is kind of issues around polarization and issues around trust. Bottom left-hand corner, very high rates of lack of trust. And in bottom right corner, the reinforcing nature of misinformation, that if you believe misinformation, you're not inclined to trust government. We have some internal polling that says if a Canadian distrusts government on one thing, they are likely not going to trust them on anything. And so the polarization, there is a sign of that it has deepened in Canadian society. It's something we should pay attention to. I would just note that the way we think about it at PCO is in terms of 3 buckets. That's another Margaretism, by the way. One bucket is folks who trust government, so we'll call these the T people. And let's say, numbers aren't important, but the buckets are. Let's say it's about 50% of the population. So generally inclined to trust government, do not trust misinformation, generally supportive of government directions. There's the middle group that I'm going to call the persuadables. So the persuadables, let's say they're about, say, between 30 and 35% of the population. They may trust some misinformation, but they can still be rallied to your cause. And then there's let's call it 15 to 20% of the population who generally believe a lot of misinformation and are very unlikely to trust government. So we need to be very worried that this group is growing, because that's a sign of polarization. But strategically, it's the persuadables that we need to focus on. We need to get them into this camp. So that's the basic dilemma that we face across policy area after policy area, is to reinforce the trust in the basics of governance. It has to do with pre-bunking, it has to do with being more fact-based, and it has to do with delivering for Canadians. If we look at the picture overall, trust picture for Canada isn't all that bad. We tend to be a middle trust country. There are lots of countries below us in the trust area. But generationally, it has gone down since the 70s. The issue of COVID fatigue has been a very important one. Remember I mentioned the 59%. That 59% represents what I think was a very healthy reaction by the Canadian population. That during the COVID crisis, people rallied around the flag. And we saw this in country after country in the OECD. But because of the nature of COVID, its enduring qualities, the changing science, the shutdowns, it exposed rifts in all countries. Even countries that were generally thought to have done very well during the pandemic, like New Zealand, found that they had riots at their national capital for the first time in 100 years. It has been a very tough time for society after society, and in particular, a very tough time for incumbent governments. So you're seeing that in country after country. It's made worse by mis and disinformation, and some of the way that gets amplified and becomes part of the discourse, and the way we kind of start to lose parts of the population. And there's also an issue of a government, in our case, a government it's approaching its 10th year. Now, there's a difference between support for the government and support for democratic institutions, and as the Assistant Secretary of Democratic Institutions, I think it's really important that we disentangle that. I think it's also really important to say that democratic events can be rejuvenating of democratic institutions. And you can see that in the data, that trust in government goes up after an electoral event, and that too is a very good sign. So why should we care about this? There are at least three reasons. The first is, I'm a simple person, dissatisfaction is bad, but it's worse when it deepens and threatens to become illegitimacy of the system. We're not at that stage in Canada. Look south of the border, you should be a little more worried. A second reason, as public servants and people who care about public services, information is a vital tool of modern governance. We use it all the time. We tell people, get a vaccine. We tell them, pay your taxes. We tell folks to make good nutritional choices. Take out the garbage on Thursday or whatever day it is here, whatever garbage day is. It's a very important tool. If we do not have trust, it reduces the value of that tool, forces us maybe to be more intrusive, and so it can be very important. I would argue it reduces government ambition as well in important ways. If you do not trust government to deliver for you, you will not trust it with ambitious national projects. And moreover, as a citizen, you'll be less inclined to make sacrifices on behalf of government if you do not trust it. So all that, I'm not sure, Eden, if that, and Coco, whether that's what you wanted, but that's my discourse on trust. Why it's important and why government needs to continue to work hard. I will show you what the OECD thinks about trust, because they've done a lot of work, because it's a common problem. And what they say is that, there are three basic potential sources of the trust problem that's facing most OECD countries. The first is that it's an engagement problem. Citizens are more educated than ever, and voting once every 4 years just doesn't do it. So how do they get more engaged? Issues around citizen assemblies. Those countries that have never had referendums think referendums are a great idea. And so some people see it as a representation issue. See it as an engagement issue. The second is representation, which is, your elected leaders need to better represent the society that they're intended to represent. So this is a diversity and inclusion point, and one that can be easier to solve for those countries that have proportional representation, because they can rank their people and ensure rough parity of different groups. It's a little harder under a first past the post system, but you've seen, of course, what Prime Minister Trudeau has done with his gender balanced cabinet as one example of how to deal with it. And then the third way of thinking about the problem is, a government that delivers the goods for citizens. I will tell you that's what I think is probably the more telling example, or the best explanation for trust issues, or high levels of trust is that there's a feeling that the government is there for you, delivering for you. And it's unfortunately the only remedy for it is hard work over time and delivery. I just further add that the OECD has done a really interesting, some thoughtful work on some of the wicked problems and how they might impact trust. So in particular, I'd point out climate change. The problem with climate change, of course, is that it's well, there are lots of problems with climate change, but the one I'd like to highlight is that it's a situation that exists across government mandates. And so you really have to be farsighted, and you won't know the answer until, maybe we're starting to see the answer now, but you won't fully see it for 10, 20 years. And by that point, it can be very late in the game. I'd also point out that COVID is seen as a wicked problem. It impacted lots of sectors of society, notably the elderly, but it did particularly impact youth, and there's no question about that. Lockdowns at a time early in your life were particularly hard on young people and had real consequences, I think, for young people's support of government. If that's their main exposure to government, is a society that locked down during a time that you really want to spread your wings. So overall, the OECD doesn't see many short-term fixes. They do see glimmers of hope. There are countries that have reversed their trust standing, but that it's relatively stable off a low level would be their analysis. All right, let's talk about institutions. Institutions have a bad reputation. I'm going to kind of outline some of those things, and then I'm going to try and provide some additional ways of thinking about institutions. The first thing is some people think of something that's institutional. They think about it as being uniform, lots of conformity. Real innovation occurs outside institutions, right? It occurs in startups, it occurs in civil society, that sort of thing. You won't have me tell you that civil society isn't a really satisfying career choice for you. It may well be. But what I would tell you is government isn't uniform. And I'll make the case in the following slides. Government can be small. Government can be nimble. There are islands of excellence. Challenge is how to find them. Right? Another way of thinking about institutions is that they're inherently evil. Right? This is the Reagan thesis. Government is the problem. And we can all benefit from some libertarian skepticism, but when it becomes nihilistic, as it did in January 6th, I think you can see the consequences of that, and we have to be very careful about our argumentation on that side. You might look at institutions and conclude that they, especially maybe Canadian institutions, and you might conclude that they're colonial, that they're racist, and they're patriarchal. And there's truth to each of those statements. I would say, though, that government has been trying to work on each of those issues. On the reconciliation side, the Prime Minister has, since the beginning of his mandate, made reconciliation one of his top priorities, continues to be. Everyone knows it's a journey, it will take time, but I think there are signs of progress. Similarly, on anti-racism, there's a sincere, honest effort at the federal level on anti-racism. It has been a top priority of the head of the public service, the clerk, the last three clerks. So both Ian Shugart, Janice Charette, and now John Hannaford have made it one of their top priorities. And I think you have seen some progress on that front too. And then on patriarchy, we've seen some progress. Gender balanced cabinet, a Senate that is gender balanced, a DM community that is approaching gender balance. I tried to get the numbers just before I arrived, and it said it kind of depends on who retires. So we're kind of in the margins of 50%. I think overall, you wouldn't give the public service an A. You should never give them an A. You should always continue to spur them to do more. But I think when you compare it to other sectors of society, there are areas where the public service is ahead, and what you can, I think, see is an earnest effort to try and make a difference on each of those areas. With that, let's talk about a different problem with institutions. So Edward O. Wilson, genius, says that we have a central problem that's extremely dangerous. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies. So anyone who has seen a hockey game knows that we have Paleolithic emotions. And I'm not talking about the players, I'm talking about the fans. Godlike technologies, check. Medieval institutions. Now it is true, we do have a king. But if you think that King Charles has the same power as a king during medieval times, your knowledge of history is somewhat skewed. Now I have seen this sort of statement where they say, well, Paleolithic emotions, 19th century institutions, and godlike technologies. So let me take on the harder question. So let's look at our institutions at the beginning of Canada. I mean, this is sort of like comparing yourself to when you were 5 years old, right? Like, you're the same person, but your capacities are much, much different. So in 1871, there were 15 organizations made up the federal government. Now there are well over 300. If you asked me to put my mind to it, I could probably get you to 400. There were 3,000 public servants. Now we are well over 335,000. Everyone was a partisan. You were hired and fired with the government. Spending, that's $14 million. I just thought it was more striking if you put it in billions. And the finance guy that I got the money from insisted I include the net debt. That's $76 million in debt in 1871. So there's a common thread, but much different situation. Let's look at the organizational structure. So that is government in 1871. There are some recognizable things, right? I'm not sure I'd rate the geological, I think I actually really like rocks, but the Geological Survey as a separate entity, I'm not sure really merited that. But there were 16 entities at that time, and that's what government looked like at the start of the Big Bang. Let's look at it now. So this is the machinery universe. This is how we in machinery of government look at government. Let me walk you through it. First of all, I never apologize for acronyms. And there are a lot there, and I won't know them all either. But these are, let's start with the size of the circles. So we think of these as suns and planets. The size of the circle is the number of FTEs. So you can see around 5 o'clock, you see Canada Post there. And around 7 or 8 o'clock, you see National Defense. So more people in those ones, but lots of little entities. Remember I said government can be small and nimble. Sure can. What about the colors? The colors are different types of organizations. The blue ones are your traditional departments. ESDC, Foreign Affairs, National Defense. They're usually the portfolio lead departments. Where it gets interesting is in some of the other colors. So you have adjudicative bodies. New tool didn't exist in 1871. It's a quasi-judicial tool to render decisions in society. We also have crown corporations. Slightly different relationship to the rest of government, often with not profit maximizing, but like more commercial terms to the way it operates, more flexibility. Now, one thing I do have to point out is and I better do it soon, is in the middle. I put PCO in the middle. So what could be more arrogant than putting the Privy Council office in the middle? Well, I put PCO in the middle because the Prime Minister is the creator of the universe. So I do not apologize for that either. So you see PCO at the middle. Let's look at some of the specific portfolios. If you look at 3 o'clock, I wish I had a laser, but I won't try and jump. I don't jump the way I used to. But at 3 o'clock, you see public safety. Very small blue dot, and the green dot is the RCMP. You've got CBSA is yellow at the bottom, and you've got CSIS, which is the third green dot. There you have a very small portfolio lead department that's expected to provide leadership to long-established entities. Public safety has only been around for 15, 20 years. The RCMP has been around since 1873. Hard to move that organization, hard to provide leadership in that situation. Another example, if you look at 7 o'clock, so this one I can get to, that's Canadian Heritage. So what you see around it are this constellation of little organizations, which are some of the granting councils. There's the CRTC as well. But the bigger one here is CBC, Library and Archives Canada. So a very rich variety. So for students thinking about the federal government, don't think of us as one thing. Think of us as 300 things. Think of us as lots of different types of jobs within that. Recognize that you can start in one place and explore the universe. All right? So there is a richness here that I don't want you to miss, because I think people, it's okay to, once you get in, to discover it and then explore. That's perfectly good. But do understand there's a rich variety here. What I like to say is choose your careers in the Canadian Public Service. At different times I've been a researcher, I've been a speechwriter, I've delivered services, and now I do this goofy thing called machinery, which isn't policy, it's not operations either. But there is a rich variety of potential jobs. So I'd just like to leave you with that. And if I only left you with one thing, that would be what I would leave you with. But I should continue. This is Machinery View. It's from David Brooks. It's a book I highly recommend called The Road to Character. And David Brooks worries about if everyone thinks outside the box deteriorates. And so this is a very much a machinery of government view that we need to take responsibility for preserving and improving institutions and transmitting that institution on a go-forward basis over time. And that that these institutions are things, yes, they're flawed, but yes, they can be improved. Yes, they can adapt and they can change. Okay, so let's try prime ministers. So you may not like politicians, you may not like prime ministers. That's fine. I'd like to show you a bit of a different perspective on prime ministers. So, in my job, we serve the prime minister. We don't help him with all of these things, but we try and help him with some of these things. So think about what a prime minister has to do. He has to set the general policy agenda for the country. He sets the machinery for the federal government. He has to lead the government in question period. Any one of those jobs is enormously taxing. But he also has a job in terms of choosing principal office holders, and also issues around the conduct of public office holders. And moreover, one thing we've noticed in recent, really decades now, is a growing role on national security, a growing role in international affairs. As a G7 country, that has consequences for Canada. The Prime Minister increasingly has a role in the international sphere, which is sometimes not well understood. And then on top of that, whenever anything goes wrong, we normally turn to the Prime Minister to deal with it, or we blame him. So, I would label it Canada's toughest job. There should never be any question that the Prime Ministers that we've had are really the smartest person in any room that they happen to be in. There should be no question. The job is so hard. They have to do so many things. And that you can't do it half committed, that it's a full out commitment, that it is based on a deep understanding of the country, that it requires a sense of where you want to take the country, and that there's a real passion to pursue the common good. And also that it's getting harder. It's getting harder for a bunch of reasons. One is the 24/7 news cycle. Another is the lack of decorum in society, which affects all leaders, including public service leaders, I would say. In the past, public service leaders were relatively anonymous. That is changing, but it particularly hits the Prime Minister. At the OECD, in Europe, the language is one of having to deal with polycrisis. It's not just cascading crisis, they're happening at the same time. So polycrisis, and also coping with mis and disinformation. That doesn't mean you should always vote for the Prime Minister, vote for whoever you want. But in terms of appreciating the role and the challenges that come with the role, I think I would like to make the case that every one of our Prime Ministers that we've had deserves an enormous amount of respect. I had a very kind of unique experience with all our living Prime Ministers. I had to call them about 2 years ago after the Queen died. And Prime Minister Trudeau decided that as a show of demonstration of respect, he wanted to invite every living Canadian Prime Minister to form part of the delegation that would go to Westminster for the Queen's funeral. And so the PMO could handle Paul Martin. They had a good connection to them. But I had to do all the others, which I was actually very nervous about, but also very delighted to do. And so this may surprise you, but I actually don't know the former Prime Minister's phone numbers, any of them. But I do have a secret weapon, which is the Prime Minister's switchboard, which can get anyone. Like, you know, they can find Waldo, they can find anybody, right? So we had to get going. It was a very short period of time, and I called each of the Prime Ministers to invite them onto the delegation. So my job, I thought, was really simple. Would you like to come? We'd love to have you. Thanks. Like a very simple conversation. There was one Prime Minister that I started out being very worried about, and I'll explain why. When I worked for Margaret, I had the privilege of being in the cabinet room. Now, the cabinet room looks like this. This is the table. Prime Minister is there. Margaret, you know where the Finance Minister is? It's right there. I was a note taker in some of the meetings in the mid-2000s when Prime Minister Chrétien may not have been always so friendly with his Finance Minister. Guess where I sat? Right there, taking notes. So I still had in my head the laser glare of Prime Minister Chrétien on my mind when I went to make a call to him. But I was confident the Prime Minister's switchboard would kind of deliver the goods for me, which they did. And so I said, well, I'd like to get Prime Minister Chrétien. He came back. He said, okay, we've got him. By the way, he's in Switzerland. What I haven't told you is I was calling at 6 p.m. So I called the Prime Minister, whose glance I will never forget, at midnight. And so what I would say to you, that he was like 87 at the time. Totally lucid, totally committed to doing his part of the service, and like charming. When I'm 87, if you wake me up at midnight, I am not going to be charming with you, right? Because his funeral's tomorrow, I will mention something about Prime Minister Mulroney. Because there's a Queen's angle. So I spoke to Prime Minister Mulroney, and I heard the baritone, and it was very smooth, and it was nice. And I thought my job was pretty simple. Would you like to come? We'd love to have you. We'll make arrangements. 12-second call. He stops me. He goes, so Alan, where are you from? And I started seeing what he was trying to do. He was trying to find a connection. Well, I'm from small town Ontario, just outside Toronto. I went to Queens. We don't have anything in common, right? I'm not from Quebec. I didn't go to Laval or St. FX. And he doesn't know where I'm from. But he tried. He kept trying to find a connection. It was charming. And so he said, well, do you have a family? So I'm talking to him about my family and getting farther and farther away from, I just want you to accept the invitation, please. So there were 3 calls. After the first call, he came back to me, and he had just been to a celebration of Michael Wilson, and he had delivered the keynote. And I think he re-delivered it to me. So some of the things that you heard about free trade, GST, apartheid, climate change, were all recited to me. And he made a point of make sure you say hello to asking me to bid hello to my wife for him, and my children. And that was only the second call. And then there was a third call. And each time, my point is that there was a style and an approach that we don't see anymore. The willingness to make a connection. He didn't need to talk to me, but I don't think he could help it. He just naturally wanted to make that personal connection. And actually, in the end, he didn't come. But that was the reason for the third call, was explaining why he couldn't. And he had a very good reason to not be able to come. It was health related. But he was trying all he could to try and be part of this. He laid out a kind of his fervent commitment to Canada even 30 years after he'd been Prime Minister, and it was really quite touching and impressive. All right. Processes. So we've got the Queen of the Cabinet process before me. Let me say there are a few words that seem more bureaucratic than process, right? Processes are where good ideas go to die, right? But good processes are where good ideas go to live, right? It provides ordered decision-making. It provides responsibility, not dispersion of responsibility. And they're absolutely key. So I know that you are all students of government. Understand how process can be your friend, how it improves decision-making. It takes time to see its beauty, but it's there, and it's really important to effective government. So let's look at the apex of decision-making in the federal system. This is the cabinet structure. A few observations. It's really complex, right? There are other systems. I will tell you as a machinery person, this is among the more complicated ones. Reminder that the Prime Minister has a big cabinet, so there are more spots around the table to be filled. There are a couple points I would make. Cabinet committees enable some issues to come to the front of the line. The fact that there's a dedicated cabinet committee to reconciliation is meaningful. It brings it to the front of the line. Relatively new cabinet committee. Well, actually, why don't I say the ones that the Prime Minister chairs in person are full cabinet, of course. Everything flows through full cabinet. So he chairs that. He chairs the Agenda, Results, and Communications Committee. This is probably among the more political of committees. Very interested in overall mandate management. Some people think of it as an kind of the inside cabinet. It hasn't functioned that way, but it does look at broad mandate issues, highly political lens. National Security Council is a new committee. It's meant to take a medium-term view of Canada's strategic interests, an area of need, and the PM is in the chair for that. He's also chair of the Incident Response Group, the ERG. That's for issues like wildfires, Gaza, quick crises that require kind of immediate decisions. I would also point you towards a relatively new feature, which is the working groups. So the working groups do not have, this will be interesting to you, Margaret. So it's just groups of ministers who work through issues. They don't treat memoranda to cabinet, but they deal with issues. So notably, clean growth projects, getting that green transformation kick-started or continued or accelerated, and then middle-class economy and housing. The affordability issue is government's number one issue. You will see that in the budget. I'm not giving anyone any news on that, but it is clearly a priority for this government. And I'd also point you to litigation management, which would kind of probably would surprise people that there is one. This has to do with how to resolve lawsuits, when to fight, when to contest, when to settle, how to deal with some of the obligations of the Crown. The economy, inclusion, and environment A and B are really domestic committees. They're meant to take on what's the domestic agenda. And so that's our cabinet structure. Here's a simpler way of looking at it. What cabinet does is it takes all the issues that may be in the Canadian discourse, could be in mandate priorities, could be societal developments, and it's a funnel, right? It makes use of what is considered in Ottawa to be the most precious resource, and that's a minister's time. So what is it that is worthy of a minister's time? Now you'll notice that I put events off to the side. You've probably heard this saying. Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Britain in the, early 60s, was asked, or late 50s, was asked what could capsize an agenda. And his response was, events, dear boy, events. COVID was a great example, right? In COVID, we had a cabinet structure that looked like this. Within, I'm not sure of the timing, it could have been within the month, we basically had one operating committee that dealt with all the COVID issues. Everything else was shutting down. There was only one functional committee because COVID was the issue of the day. And the ability of government, the Westminster system, to adapt and to change in response to events is one of its best features. So I want to sum up. The first is, I hope you get from this talk that Queen's has laid a good foundation for you, right? None of you did any readings for this lecture, and yet I hope you understood what I was talking about. I hope you also understand that learning doesn't stop at school, that there's plenty of learning to happen in your career, and I encourage you to seek out those jobs that have that as part of the benefit. And the second thing is just a bit of a pitch for the federal government. I want to encourage you to think inside the box. We'd be lucky to have you, and we'd appreciate having you. So thank you very much for your time.
So to begin, before actually talking about the evolving demographics and diversity of the public sector itself, we want to talk about the history of the Canadian public service and talk about the Indigenous government and relations within Canada's orders of governance itself.
So we would like to first pose this question to Dan, but we would also like to hear others react after Dan's spoken. So we want to know, how can the Canadian government draw from Indigenous governance models, particularly the historical example of the Council of Six Nations, to enhance our country's success in public service? And what can the Canadian public learn from your messages?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And before I begin speaking, one of the things I do have to do is apologize right off the bat, because I have to leave in 10 minutes. I have I don't know how and why this happens, but there's a convergence of something that we're making, a major policy proposal at 1:30 today, and so I need to be, and I'm one of the principals in that proposal. So so that is, as I say, I don't know why it converged at exactly the same time as this, but c'est la vie, I guess. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and again, my apologies. I'm really sorry about this. In terms of traditional governance, one of the things that our speaker and the keynote speaker was talking about the structure of government, the structure of the machinery of government. And one of the things that, when we go back in history, there was a recognition of the structures of the Indigenous governance, and my ancestry is Mohawk, and Mohawk is one of the Six Nations. The original Six Nations were only 5 nations, and the Tuscaroras joined in the mid-1600s, but it's still called Six Nations. And but the Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is also called the Iroquois Confederacy, its symbols on it are still 5. There's still 5 symbols. The thing that in the dissertation, in my own dissertation, when I was undertaking research, one of the things that came up really strongly, basically in all of the issues across the country in terms of Indigenous governance, culture runs so deep. It is, and that became very apparent. And so we have to look back at sort of the principles that why the culture is so important to Indigenous people. And it really boils down to a different worldview. And the worldviews are different, and what is happening with respect to programming and how things are done. You know, when I talk to some people that talk about it, it's like fitting square pegs in round holes, because the programming, when you look at the structure of government now and government programming, the ideology behind all of that is structured so that it doesn't fit. It just doesn't fit into the Indigenous community. So, there are efforts going on, and the efforts are well received. However, it's still square pegs in round holes. And how do you manage that? Well, we go back into my sense is that one of the things that Canada still does not recognize are traditional governments. Six Nations has the Haudenosaunee Confederacy still has traditional governance and government structures, and there are still a lot of people in the Haudenosaunee communities who follow that, and a lot of that comes through and is founded in the culture, and it's practiced in the ceremony, it's practiced in the language, and when that happens, I mean, there's a continuation of the principles that are involved in traditional governance. Big example, a very stark example, is in terms of the worldview, is in terms of the environment. The ideological situation of Western ideology in terms of resources, say resources are there to be exploited, and resources are the foundation of the wealth of the country. The ideology in Indigenous, in the Haudenosaunee, and I'll speak to that rather than generalizing Indigenous, is that the ideology is that we are simply one part of the environment, and everything, how we fit into that environment is a relational thing. That instead of being masters over all the environment and being able to extract and do everything with the resources. So that whole ideology is very different, and that is one thing that if we're looking at climate change, we're looking at, we need to take a different look. Now, one of the, and as I say, the Canadian government still has not recognized the principles of governance. If we use the U.S. as an example, and the U.S. is not a very good example these days, but in the formation of the United States, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a printer by trade, and he actually printed a lot of the treaties that were being done. So he was very familiar with some of the activity that was going on. And one of the things that he wrote to another printer after he went and visited some of the activity that was going on with the Haudenosaunee. He wrote to another printer, and his letter reads, "It would be a strange thing if 6 nations of ignorant savages should be capable of forming such a union, the Confederacy, and yet it has subsided for ages and appears indissoluble, and yet a little union should be impractical for 10 or a dozen English colonies." That was done in March 20th, 1751. 3 years later, he penned the first draft of the Constitution of the United States, and there's quite a bit of information about his writing. And the thing that I took away from that is that his recognition of savages, they did not know what they were doing. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is considered to be one of the most democratic institutions that has ever been developed, and it's still there. And the thing, and again, going back to the government of Canada, the government did not recognize that, because all of the leadership today are functions of the Indian Act, which was put into place. The Indian Act was actually the second piece of legislation that the government of Canada did after Confederation. And so it's changed a little bit here and there, but it's ideologically still the same as it was put in place in 1867. So the governing structures, there is a lot to learn. There is a lot to learn because of ideology. And one of the things that we that is there as well is that within the Indigenous structures, nobody is asking them to change to what we believe. Is simply a recognition that that different structure exists and there is validity to it. That concept goes back ages. I mean, in Western ideology as well. That goes back to the treaty, the Westphalia Treaty in 1648, where the basis of the recognition of sovereignty of different countries was put into place. And I think it was the treaty, peace treaty, that was end of the 30-Year War. Not certain which war that was in Europe. Similarly, in North America, there was a treaty put together between nations, between the Anishinaabe peoples and the Haudenosaunee, the treaty was called the Dish with One Spoon. And the Dish with One Spoon was a treaty, an agreement of sharing the resources and sharing the land in this part of the world. It's unclear when that treaty was put into place, but it was well before European contact. It was ratified by the Treaty of Montreal in 1701. And so those organizations, those governing institutions were there. They were structured, they were set up, they were recognized by different nations for each other. And that's one of the things that I think government, even today, the government has difficulty recognizing that and recognizing that there are institutions and structures. Now, the conundrum is that a lot of the governing structures right now are have been set up by the Indian Act, and people have been using that somewhat reluctantly and perhaps ineffectively for well over 100 years now. So that creates a conundrum. So reconciliation, as was mentioned earlier, reconciliation not only has to take place between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, it also has to take place within our own community, about how you actually make that work. We could, if we had another 2 hours, we could get into the whole impact of religion on this as well. So, that is a very, very high-level overview of Indigenous governance and tradition, and how the traditional governance, there are philosophies or ideologies that I think could serve the entire country and the entire world well. So policy policy is built on ideology. And reconciliation is more than a word. And one of the things that we find now because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that happened, a lot of people are starting to get a little upset. And as you pointed out this morning, that whole area of trust really comes into play. And but trust is sort of the result of action, and that is something that is really difficult to put into place. So with those few words, I apologize that I have to leave, and because I would love to stay and talk with you and talk with the panel, but I do have to go. I'm sorry. So
There's no issue. Can we get a round of applause for So, from hearing about that, we know about the actual obligations, responsibilities, the history of Canada, and what can be done, what has historically been done as well. I would like to get a sense of the actual demographic shifts in Canada. We do have a lot of younger generations getting into the workforce. We do have a recognition of Indigenous peoples and minority groups in Canada now, but I want to get a better perspective on it. If I may pose this question to Lori, how does the public sector need to adapt to reflect the evolving demographics and diversity of the Canada's public sector?
I'm pretty loud. I might probably just yell at you. Thank you. Thank you. Here we go. Now I can hear myself. Okay. Okay, so changing demographics. All right, now I honestly am probably not the best person on this panel to answer that question because I'm not a public servant. And so I'm going to say a couple of things and then I would think we should open to everybody else. I think a couple of things. One is I'm not a public servant, but I teach future public servants. And I think it is true that there are different expectations now around what work is going to be like and how it will be structured. I think that my students do not, kind of putting words in some of your mouths here, but I don't think that they're necessarily looking for a place-based 8:30 to 4:30 kind of gig all the time. I think that there's some expectation that work will become more flexible. I think that this is something that's going to be weeded out through conversations with with unions in the public sector and things like that. But I think there's some shifting around what work is going to be like. And I also think that there's going to be some shifting in public administration and public policy schools have to get on board with this. There's a shift in what kind of skills people want and people need. And so, in some ways, we are going to be behind on this a little bit because as something like COVID happens, then you see this huge shift in an organization like the public service that is an enormous organization. It's difficult to change, but it had to make changes right away. And so now there's a normalization about hybrid work, for example. There's also a normalization around service delivery that is digitized. There are assumptions around use of information to make services better. There are assumptions around that some of the trust pieces. I think people are coming at that differently than they had before. That's a whole other story. And so some of this, even something like building trust, Al's points this morning about why governments need trust, why that's important. It's not just a nice to have, they need it. How do we build trust when it's broken? These are skill sets we have to build into the public service, and I don't think I don't know that all of the programs that are in place now in universities that are there to help public servants become public servants, I'm not sure that we're hitting all these boxes. So we need to rethink that. There are probably, I don't know what the right number is, I'll shut up soon, I promise. I'm not sure how many people who become public servants have MPAs. So I feel like we need to figure that out too, right? Because when we're teaching in public policy and public administration programs, we are always doing so with the mindset that now you're going to go on and be the best and brightest public servants there are. And I'm not sure, actually, what the mapping on is like. right? And so, not that the MPA is the only way there, but I feel like it would be really fun to put some linkages together between Al and Warren and all the Als and Warrens in the country and figure out how we should be kind of recalibrating our own, our training and our skills building and what that looks like over time. There's a whole bunch of other points to make too, which on that.
I guess in addition to that, I'd also like to see if there's more of a sense of also in addition to the skill sets, but also with the changing demographics of people themselves as well. If anyone on this panel can speak to it, I think maybe Margaret, do you think there is a priority shift, I would say, in terms of policy areas or even just what measures might be put into place that can actually, I would say, facilitate changing perspectives in peoples within Canada?
All right, is this a question also about global change, or is this about inside Canada change?
I'd say
You want to go? Okay. Because I'm more, okay, well, on the inside Canada change, and I think there's obviously a generational shift happening that Lori talked about. I guess millennials now outnumber boomers, which is a very sad thing for some of us, but so that's the dominant, but also that'll end up changing voting patterns, but also what politicians and political parties respond to. So there's definitely a generational change going on. And then there's also the changes in the workforce that aren't just happening in terms of hybrid work, not just happening because of COVID, but also because I think different generations want to work differently and have grown up differently, they're digital natives and whatever. And that's not just in the public sector, we're going to find it in the private sector as well. So there's these generational demographic shifts going on. And then Canada's clearly not just a very different country than it was when Al's 1871. Not only, was the Indigenous, our Indigenous populations and communities not reflected necessarily then, but we have now a much more diverse population, and it's going to get more diverse. And I think Al had some good numbers this morning. I think that is beginning to be reflected inside the federal public service in terms of, one, gender. Where actually I had a number for you, which was that 50% plus of executives in the federal public service are now women, which is a big number, and as it should be. But also in terms of invisible minorities or persons with disabilities, those numbers, actually Indigenous numbers are up in terms of workforce availability. The other numbers are moving up, but not far enough. And as Al also mentioned, the previous clerk of the Privy Council, Ian Shugard, who just passed away, unfortunately, he had a call to arms, a call to action around racism and discrimination. And Janice Charette echoed that, and the new clerk of the Privy Council, John Hanford, has also doubled down on that. I just saw a clip of him saying this is also my call to action. And I think, I'm not in the system right now, but I do think that is actually really hard. I mean, they really mean it. Now, maybe not working perfectly, there's still issues that pop up. I would go beyond just like it's the right thing to do, because in terms of reflecting Canada's communities and Canada's population, and providing opportunities, equal opportunities, or better for all individuals. I do subscribe to the fact that we will be more excellent. The Canadian public service will be more excellent if it has greater diversity, and particularly now that may be my segue into my global change, because the issues now are so diverse and coming at us from so many different directions that we just cannot think in the same boxes and the same pathways that we used to. So I'll let others talk more about the demographics and issues, but I'm going to do my little segue to how the world is completely disordered and changing and what that means for Canada. Is that okay? Go for it? Okay, again? Okay. Okay, so Al mentioned this. I mean, there's Adam Tooze, who's a famous historian, coined the term polycrisis last year. But essentially, we all know that I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Like, they're just, everything's happening all at once. Everything everywhere all at once, right? Everything everywhere all at once. We have climate change impacts happening right now, for those of us who live very close to the Rideau Canal. Climate change is happening, technological change, AI, we have a new outburst of geopolitical competition that's just not going to go away. I mean, we had a global pandemic with the possibility of others to come. And you can just go on, and you all know what those are, and they're very scary. It's not just that they're all happening, it's that they're compounding, and in fact, sometimes they're multiplying or accelerating each other. So we've never lived, I don't think, most people would say, Adam Tooze is the famous, is right, we've never lived in a context which has been so confounding in terms of its implications. So from a government point of view, the operating system, or the strategic context of the operating system within which governments around the world, the Canadian government, the Ontario have to function, is quite a bit different. You add to that the 24/7 news cycle and the speed and the velocity at which events hit governments now. There's the complexity and the velocity that is unheard of. And the thing is that it's not going to slow down, it's just going to accelerate. So that is the world that we're all living in and have to think our way through, and all of you are going to work in. So 3 things about what does that mean? If I could just start with my little global affairs pitch here, global public policy. In Canada, I think we have felt kind of immune to a lot of things. So there's a little expression in the foreign policy world that Canadians live in a fireproof house. If Kim Nozzle was here, Canadians live in a fireproof house, far from flammable materials. So this is a quote from a senator in the 1920s. The idea being that, we're far away from wars, we're protected by the Arctic, we got our best friends and neighbors to the south, and we're kind of cool here. And Canada, we fought the wars, Cold War bothered us, but for the last number of decades, we've been pretty darn complacent about all that shit can happen out there in the world, and we're kind of okay. That's over, because these threats and these challenges that are happening are transnational, whether it's whether it's climate, whether it's the Arctic is melting, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's foreign interference and cyber, whatever, they're coming. They aren't stopping at the 49th border. They're not stopping in the Arctic. They're coming to our shores, into our homes, into our businesses, and whatever. So we are no longer safe, and this is a realization that I think Canadians are slowly coming to. And also, we also have the United States of America, the South, our best friend and neighbor and ally, and we all have friends and relatives there. And we're not so sure how dependable they're going to be in the future. So all of a sudden for Canada, you got all this stuff going on in the world. And for Canada, we're going to have to just sort of figure out that this is actually a much more threatening world. We can find our way through it, but it's a new way of thinking than we've had before. Not just governments, but Canadians. Number 2, there's domestic issues and international issues. I kind of work on both of them. And, we've known for a long time that they can intermingle. Certainly, housing policy, whoever's going to the housing ministry, that's kind of something you do in the municipal government provision. Some issues are domestic, but all kinds of issues are no longer just domestic. They are so totally impacted and influenced by what's happening globally. And that has also risen all kinds of new issues, I think this is your point, Coco, that have risen to the top that aren't there. So education's not going away, health's not going away, and housing's not going away, et cetera. But all of a sudden, climate is at the top of the list, not necessarily in what you'll see in polls in terms of what people care about today, but it is actually there in terms of how government and how people are going to have to work through this climate, not just mitigation, but adaptation, all the issues around in technology and information, disinformation, cyber, all the issues around energy transition, natural resource development, and the issues that I think that Al got into about democracy and threats to our democracy. So these issues are all being impacted by global events, and I think are increasingly now new issues that have been thrown up that people inside government and outside government will have to wrestle with. And that then, thirdly, to say, so that means that the skills that we all have to have, that you all have to have, are going to be, and we can come back to this later, are I think really exciting, but also more challenging in terms of how you have to work with complexity at speeds that even Al and I didn't have 10, 15 years ago in the Privy Council office. The speed at which things have to have and the complexity of these issues, I think, are, on the one hand, kind of exhilarating if you really get off on. It's really, really interesting, but it does mean that it puts more of a premium on the ability for government leaders but also public servants to be able to work and adapt and perform in that environment. So I'll stop there. That's just, it's a new world out there, a very disordered and confounding world.
Thank you for that insight. And I'm a little more curious now in terms of adapting and what the digital transformation we're seeing right now in terms of the evolution. And it's been quite rapid, I would say, especially after COVID too. We've seen a lot of adaptations to technologies. And I'm quite curious, David, since you're in both spheres, I would say, what would you say are the biggest challenges the Canadian Public Service that they're facing right now in terms of technologies? And if you might also add in how you've seen it maybe addressed, or maybe where they haven't been addressed.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll try to build off of a couple of points Margaret and Maria made. And I think, when we think about demographics and how that plays into technology, I think one of the points Lawyer made around MPAs, more and more as the size of the public service has grown, and obviously Al showed a great visual that really brought it to life. Particularly what I've observed moving from a cabinet office, the Ministry of Finance to a crown corporation is the public service is bringing more and more people in because of these hard technical skills that don't necessarily have an appreciation for the institution, the history, the mechanics of how it all works. And so you've got this piece where I can tell you, as a crown corporation, less than 5% of my staff come from a place where they have MPAs or they have a background in government. They come from the business world, they come from other private sector organizations. And so I think number one, there's a role that we have to play for those of us who come from programs like this and go to the public service to help to educate and help to talk about the purpose behind a lot of the way the institutions are designed and bring people along. And that can be very rewarding for those that come from the private sector, can add purpose, can add drive to the things that they're doing and bring life. But simultaneously, the solutions that governments have to solve on a very quick basis, and again, frontline agencies have to adapt and change right now. You're dealing with a technology landscape that is extremely complex. And in government, one of the things that's particularly tough in large organizations is really having that macro view to understand and say, at the end of the day, technology is there to bring a process to life, to make a problem solved faster or more efficiently. And I think people, that silo kind of mentality can come and play quite a bit. And organizations are quick to, you see this in the news constantly with government organizations, to launch technology, to look at technology, to be the solutions, to look at all the bells and whistles that something will come out of the box. But where most of the rub happens is the gap between existing processes that come into play and then technologies that have been designed for other ecosystems. And there's this constant challenge of are the government organization's process is going to evolve to match the way the technology is designed, or are we going to customize the heck out of the technology to meet our needs? And that ends up being a lengthy, costly exercise. Every government organization goes through those challenges and pays for it many years later. And it's a tough process, but I think the technology is becoming so complex that the ability to customize it to your needs is becoming harder and harder. And it's a very harsh reality that government agencies and organizations are saying, let me step back and say, should I be changing? Should I be changing to the technology? Should I be changing to the way that the consumer, in my case, or the Ontario Canadian wants their services delivered? And what does that mean when you back that up upstream? Maybe something more practically, again, to build off the point of demographic changes is, yes, we have a lot of young leaders, and I'll put myself in that category, that are being thrusted into leadership positions in the public service. And there is disconnect, the digital natives and dealing with folks across organizations that have a tremendous amount of experience, but are struggling with that gap. And so I think, again, if you're going into some of the organizations, I've heard some of you have co-ops in, there's an opportunity to bridge that gap, to to reach out and talk to organizations that you're going to understand the way things have been working for a very long time, understand the technology that is at, in the organization and available, or the technology that's coming, and to try to bridge that gap and bring others along, because there's a lot of technology that's available right now that's not getting utilized to its fullest, and most government organizations are not 1 or 2 generations behind the technology anymore. They're 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 systems behind. And of course, we're AI and everything else we're seeing. I mean, we're a Microsoft shop. Our systems are changing every month. There's not a deployment twice a year. There's a deployment once or twice a month, where fundamentally new capabilities are coming online every day. And it takes a long time for people to catch up into what happens.
Thanks everyone. I'm going to go stop my class. Thank you.
Thanks for that answer. And unfortunately, our Lord Turnbull has to attend the PMPA.
It's not unfortunate. It's just.
We like to hear from you, but thank you all again. If you get a round of applause for Lord Turnbull.
I just want to build on what Dave had to say. Because a lot of it resonated with sort of a hard experience at the federal level. And really part of the challenge around customization or the over-tailoring of public policy. We've had some bad experiences with things like the Phoenix pay system, which kind of too much tailoring, too many exemptions, complicated the system to the point that it became unusable and had to be reworked. And similarly, we have challenges with the employment insurance system for many of the same reasons. So the instinct's usually good, right? You want to make it more tailored. Actually, Margaret used to call it boutique-y. More designed for a specific group, but it's at odds with the overall delivery imperative. And I think what you were saying is we really need to learn the true capacity of the technology, and maybe start with it more often and less with kind of the customization imperative. One of the things that happened during COVID was because of the crisis sometimes forces change, right? And it shouldn't take a crisis to create change, but it sometimes has that impact. And one of the things that we reflected on after the crisis was, what were the things that we did in a crisis situation that should be the new normal for government? And what are the things that we had to do, but in times of peace, if I can call it that, we should not continue? And that's something that we're continuing to think through. It is true that we didn't, Margaret will know I used to be a big fan of royal commissions. We didn't do a royal commission for the federal government, but there have been lessons learned at the departmental level in different departments where we're trying to gather and harvest those lessons under fire, under crisis, to try and improve effectiveness. Final point I'd make on this one is citizen expectations. I think the gap is growing between what we can deliver and what citizens expect. Like if you think about government, are we closer to Amazon or are we closer to analog? And too often we're closer to analog, and that's the problem.
Just a little coda on that. I think Janice Charette, who stepped down about 6-8 months ago as the clerk of the Privy Council, the head of that whole universe that in the PCO had at the center that Al showed you. She's a tremendous public servant. But one of the things she said when asked about, so what's your sense of where the public service of Canada is at? And she said exactly that. We need to move from being an analog organization to digital. Not to say they don't do some things, but just it's not just a couple of iterations of whatever else. And that's the kind of fundamental change that has to happen. And there's reasons why that hasn't happened. It's not just that lack of, sometimes it can come down to cultural issues, risk aversion, whatever, but a lot of it comes down to you have to invest in it. You have to invest in it, and you have to have the talent to do it, and sometimes governments have been reluctant to invest in things that nobody actually sees. And now I think that these chickens are coming home to roost because Canadians actually expect a level of service that, that sometimes government can't quite deliver. I'll just give you one little success story, because I had this conversation with somebody a couple of days ago, and we were, there's this podcast that was going on about, you know, all this series of horrible things, ArriveCan, this and that, and when we were talking about the passport office. But if you actually look at the passport office, which was a huge problem after COVID, then this flood of people that wanted to travel. The passport office had people working, you know, in basements all over the land, could not keep up, huge challenge, all over the papers, a crisis, the government's on its feet in the House of Commons. But if you look now, the problem is actually fixed. And they're actually, for the most part, they actually are meeting their timelines and their deliverables. You can get your passport. So something happened in that crisis, going back to there was some burning platform, and either it was just because the political leaders just put so much heat down on the organization, but I think they actually had to sit back and completely rethink how they were going to deliver passports for Canadians on time and effectively. And so it did happen. You don't hear that story, but I'm telling it to you now. You don't hear some of the good stories, but there are ways to fix some of these things.
Can I just build off? That's very true. And you won't recall the box under the Cabinet Committee, but one of them was on a subcommittee on service delivery. And that committee was wholly dedicated to passports for a period of time, getting ministers together. There's an interesting kind of interaction between our immigration department and our Service Canada department that had to be smoothed out and streamlined in order to kind of affect some of the changes. By the way, passports were a problem across the world. It wasn't a uniquely Canadian thing, although it felt pretty personal when you were the one waiting for your passport. But Margaret's quite right that the problem itself has been resolved painfully, but that is an example ultimately of government change brought on by crisis.
So with an example of that achieved really good outcomes, do you think there's opportunity to achieve more equity in policy with new technologies?
Well, maybe I'll start it from a different angle. I mean, you know, first, all technology is supposed to be deflationary, right? So if you look at the cost of operating for a lot of government bodies, you know, again, Al up there, the growing debt and sort of, you know, we're seeing as interest rates are where they are, a change in the electorate and their tolerance to government spending at the levels that maybe they have been spending. You know, the suite of technology that's available on that, those deflationary impacts, and the level of service that citizens are expecting across the board does allow you to deploy technologies that really everybody is using outside the world of government already. So from a starting point, I guess, I'm trying to come at it from a different angle, but from a starting point, I think it takes some of the pressure out of redeveloping the system or rethinking through those policies by moving quick to accessing technologies that out of the box provide that flexibility. And you know, one of the things I would say is one of the hardest things and it's changing really quickly. It's just that interaction between government bodies and the customers or the citizens that they serve. And I think you know, what we're seeing is it doesn't take the biggest lobbyists anymore. It doesn't take you know, a concerted amount of effort to impact policy changes to get your voice heard. There's other ways to get there, and a lot of that is technology driven. You know, we're just again focusing on the crisis. I know in Ontario at least there's a big focus on agencies and ministries on how you engage with your stakeholders, and you know, there isn't an expectation you're going to spend big budgets and go out and crisscross the province and hold, you know, sessions for every topic. And so that forces you right there to think about, you know, how do you leverage what's available to you? How do you, just something simple as, Zoom and team calls that bring voices to the table that I don't think we saw those voices at the table 5-6 years ago. And so, again, it's pretty simple. There's nothing super revolutionary there other than to say that those who are developing this technology are developing it to be very democratic, developing it to make it as accessible as possible. The cost of entry is very low, that I think it opens up that opportunity on our side of the fence to, again, serve those populations a lot better.
Thank you for the answer. And just thinking about more in the sense that you talked about accessibility technologies that were there, and in terms of what the audience can take in as well, I'm quite curious. There's a lot that is tied at Queen's here in terms of the actual perspective of governance, public sector, private sector, and what's there. But there's also that idea that we have to also look into what skills are needed, what development outside of universities, and even in the actual workforce when we might be 10 years into the actual job stuff. What do we need to learn? In this ever-evolving world, what do you think would be one or two things people in the audience can do that can actually help within the workforce?
Well, I can kick it off and just say, knowing that these demographic changes are happening, one of the biggest gaps for me, particularly amongst young people that are joining our organization and other organizations across the government, is the people leadership skills. That is something that is very difficult to pick up really quick, to just read a book or take a course, and you have to go through the time and process of really building a team and learning to manage a team. And so I think the number one thing I would say is those going into your organization right now, it's really easy to focus on your stream of work. It's really easy to fall into your silo. And more than ever, I think there's a need for students doing co-ops or et cetera to really get out and build those connections. And it's tough, and you may not get a chance to have a team out of the gate. It may take some time, but you might get thrusted up the ladder a little bit quicker than you thought. And so there's a great opportunity when you're first in those early years in the public service to not necessarily seek out job titles or seek out specific organizations, but really look at the culture that is in that particular department, the culture that's in that body, who is the leader that you could learn from and work for. And I think that will go a lot further than, hey, I'm in this ministry or I'm not that ministry. Having a good mentor, having a leader, having a culture that, again, we talked about the constant crisis, and that's the reality for everyone in the public service. But certain places have great cultures of resiliency. And there's a few key ingredients to resiliency, and when you can spot them and find those cultures as a young person in the public service, to jump into those and learn in those areas, I think you will position yourself that 5, 10, 15 years down the road, if you get thrusted into an area of leadership and an area of managing more people that you don't typically have experience for, you'll find that you have a lot of the skills that you didn't appreciate.
I just want to build on that. So I spend a lot of time thinking about organizations, but even I know that government is really about teams of people. And one of the key things is to get on a good team. And that can open up opportunities that you won't otherwise have. And I think if you look at most careers in public service, those people that have done super well have been part of a good team. So I would encourage you to seek out a good team. You may not be on one right away. And that's where my second piece of advice would be, which is you've got to find a way to explore and to network and to reach across organizations, so that if you're not on a good team at the moment, you know where the good team will be or who the good people are. And when I say explore the public service in all its diversity and uniqueness, that's part of how you need to do it. And so particularly if you're an introvert, I'm sorry, you have to get to know a few people, and you have to reach out across, in particular, horizontal things. When I look at what the public service is looking for right now, I focus on a couple of things. And one is an ability to think carefully about operations. Doesn't mean that you necessarily have a degree in it. I'm not sure exactly what a degree is, but you have to show a capacity to understand operations and service delivery. You have to understand kind of the organization in which you work and what it is that they do for citizens that makes a difference. Particularly as times get tougher in the public service, and we won't always be in a boom time, that the higher ground tends to be in operations. So I'd encourage you to think carefully about issues of operations. I also think that the public service of the future needs to be more strategic communications minded, to deal with things like mis and disinformation and how do we approach that, because we have trouble with it. I think that tomorrow's public service also needs to have a much thicker skin than public servants currently have, because you're going to be in the limelight more often. That's one of the changes that we're seeing in the recent years, is that senior public servants are on the firing line in a way they hadn't expected. So that is something. If you're looking for something that, is a here and now problem for government, it's understanding AI. And there are a bunch of dimensions to it. One is, how is it a tool for customer service delivery? And then another one is just, how is it a tool for knowledge synthesis? And if it is a tool for knowledge synthesis, why do we need policy people? I think we still have a case for policy people. I'm a policy person myself. I'm not in a pure policy job, but I'm a policy person. But I think it's about understanding what your real value added would be when you have kind of this knowledge synthesis base that you can draw upon. So anyway, a few thoughts on that.
Thank you. I totally agree with my colleagues here, everything that they said. But I wanted to add a few points. Just working back from the AI analogy. AI can put out a good maybe policy brief, a good letter, a good this and that. But AI will not be able to bring people together to solve problems or to work across governments, federal provincial governments, or with other sectors that you need to work. I mean, that ability to work as a team, those kinds of ability to understand and work with people to solve problems, that is something that technology is not going to replace and is really core to the kind of skill set. And I think, hopefully all of you coming through this program will have had lots of experience with that. But let me just go back. The kinds of skills, I think the MPA, the kind of critical thinking, problem-solving skills that you're going to need no matter where you are in government or the private sector, quite frankly. If you listen to employers and what you get hired for as an entry level, I know that's what you all want right now, but like that entry level, what you want 10 years ago, aren't necessarily the same things. The knowledge that you have now, the degree you have, is great, gets you in the door. But the people that get ahead are the ones who will bring the problem solving, that will bring the critical thinking, will bring to be able to build the teams and make the teams work. And that's the difference maker. And to get there, you have to seek out these opportunities and not just continue to learn and continue to be able to seek out those kinds of challenges. I just wanted to, I think, two other points. One is just the speed at which, the degree to which people are going to be needing to be constantly changing and adapting, or the kind of complexity and speed at which events are going to be hitting government in particular, but also the private sector, also requires a degree of adaptation and resilience. I mean, in the olden days, you may have a week to write a note and maybe someone make a decision. Eventually, these things are going to be happening at warp speeds. So that ability to be nimble and adaptable. I just want to final point, which goes back to something that Al talked to us about this morning in his master class. If you're in government and you're a public servant or a corporation as well, you're my freshwater saltwater analogy. You're a freshwater. You are a freshwater fish. You just are. But you have to swim in these salty waters, and you have to be able to relate to the salty water fish. But then you go back to your freshwater. you have to have an acuity, a political acuity to understand what governments are trying to achieve, what your minister is trying to achieve, what your head of your agency is trying to achieve. Doesn't mean you become partisan, but it doesn't mean you're partisan, you're wearing the flag or whatever. That's not your job. But your job is to really understand what they're trying to achieve and help them meet that objective. And that requires a degree of acuity around that. And quite often public servants don't want to swim. They think it's kind of dirty, right? If you swim until you go into that salty water pond. Well, no, as long as you remember that you're a freshwater fish, you're fine. But you have to have the ability to swim in those waters, to understand those waters. And quite frankly, that was the thing that took me the longest time. You know, I was a little bit of a goody-goody girl student type that just kind of did my policy wonk thing, and it took me a while as I got more senior to really get that skill. And I think people need it sooner now, because I think that the waters are flooding over us a little bit more. I don't have allergies with that, anyways.
Thank you for those perspectives, and I think that it's quite a lot there in terms of what can be done, what should be done, and also what we're already doing. So I'd like to leave this for the last comments and closing remarks from each of the panelists, starting from Al himself. In terms of what Canada does so far well and what we can look forward to in the future in public service, may you speak to it in a bit for us, or in a few words?
What we do well.
We do machinery well.
I think there's still an ability for the public service to collaborate. There's a lot of talk about horizontal work. I think that it's something that we've learned. I know that there will be silos from time to time, but most of the really important problems that governments are called on to solve have a horizontal dimension, and I think we're much better than we used to be at solving them across those barriers. Like we've learned. I think that was one of the COVID lessons, the ability of different organizations. So if you think of the Public Health Agency, at the time of COVID, it was one of the sleepier areas of government, and yet buttressed by human resources to surge its capacity and support from other departments, it was able to do a credible job at kind of dealing with the pandemic, which had so many different elements to it. And I really saw in an impressive way deputies from different departments working together for the common good, and not being kind of hidebound by their kind of departmental silo interests, but more really, again, the crisis kind of forces some things. Some of the illusions fall when you're dealing with a crisis. And what I saw there was a public service that was able to work in a pretty nimble way. So that's something we did well.
I can add a couple things. I think, what do we do really well? Well, where there's a tension, where there's sometimes political tension, where there's a will, we rally together pretty good and get the job done. And they're looking for a career that you're never going to be bored in. There's plenty of opportunity. And I think, there's ability to take ownership of what you're working on, to be driven by purpose, to, put front and center the customer or the end citizen that you're serving, and rally people around that. I think the kind of noble calling that draws a lot of us to this is still there and stronger than ever, in my view. What is tough, again, is the pace at which delivery is expected. The fact that it can't just be one thing that we rally around, it has to be 10 different things being done simultaneously. So I would agree with Al that having an operational mindset to understand your operating model, as I like to say it. So, your people, your process, your technology, your measures that ultimately you're driving, to think about those simultaneously. How do they work together? How do they interact with each other? on a daily basis is really key, and to be able to navigate that, to find the pain points and adjust them quickly is important. But the opportunities are there and they're abundant, and with the demographic shifts, there is a need for young people to step up and carry the torch and look at some of these problems that we're facing that are novel or a new spin on age-old problems. So there's no shortage there. It's a pretty exciting space to be in. And again, you're coming with the advantage of being digital natives and knowing the technology more than sometimes the people making the decisions of which technology gets selected. So that gives you another way to go.
Well, those were both excellent. I shouldn't add anything more. I said about not only what Canada does well, but what Canadian governments do well. Is that the key question you're asking about? Well, I might end up sounding a bit defensive, being a former federal public servant, but sometimes you don't hear the stories about all the things that do go well, that are delivered. I actually, to prepare coming down here, I reread the most recent report from the clerk, Privy Council to the Prime Minister of Canada, something that the clerk does every year. It kind of sets out, how the year went, and it's not the end of the world, but it's a good statement, and I know that the clerk puts a lot of thought into it. This is an opportunity also to talk about some things that do go so well that they're fixing, but also some to kind of champion some things that go well. And if you read that, and I encourage you to read that, we forget, about the Canadian Coast Guard that's out there, rescuing ships, and the people who test the waters and fisheries, and the fact that there are how many millions of Canadians that are dependent upon the delivery of their pension checks and their employment insurance checks, and these things happen. And sometimes actually it's kind of scary because those systems, those technological systems are pretty fragile, but these things happen, and it just kind of happens, and they have to continue. And you're not going to get a pat on the head for that. That's your job, but there's all kinds of things that are going right in the country, and we know the things that federal government particularly, not very good at, big IT, a degree of risk aversion or lack of innovation, although there are certainly pockets of that, or islands of opportunity and innovation, as you said. But also thinking about the crisis and the COVID crisis, or you think what happened in Canada, but around the world. But I mean, there was people shut down, but also the government of Canada had to, how many millions of Canadians had to be brought back into the country, filtered back through the country, the extent to which it had to kind of, everybody went home. People just left their offices, their plants, their clothes, their running shoes, and they went home and they didn't come back. And yet government had to continue. And so we don't talk about that because no one's going to say, yay, way to go. But it does show a degree of adaptability and whatever. My final point would be around, I think, what government is really good at, and why I would encourage people to go into government or go in and out or have a chance at it, is that it's a sense of purpose, and that David mentioned, which can be, so it's your purpose in terms of service. Obviously, the democratically elected government decides what the priorities of the day are. But, looking at David, I mean, he goes into the emergency room, saving lives and taking care of people. That's a purpose, a mission. You know why you're doing it. It's not quite the same as the emergency room, David, but when you're working in government, that sense of purpose, that you're actually serving Canadians, and it's actually felt, for the most part, as a deeply held trust. So the sense around values and ethics in the public service and why you're doing it, and why then, if you're doing it, why it matters, why it has to be done with excellence and with integrity, is, I think, really core. I think the clerk is also worried that there were 100,000 people who kind of came in or out of the public service in the last 3 or 4 years during COVID that may not have been imbued quite so much, or maybe perhaps they're brought in for a specific job on this, but they don't actually see the bigger picture in terms of the service to Canadians and the trust that you have to earn with Canadians and deliver for Canadians. So you have to constantly be working at these values and ethics. But I think in terms of what's good about what the ultimate good is about that sense of public service the trust, the integrity, the excellence you have to bring to it. And at the end of the day, you know, even in the dark times, I think public servants would tell you that that's really what motivates them. I don't know. Am I over the top here, Alan? Over the top?
No.
He says I'm not over the top.
I don't think you're over the top. I don't think you're over the top either, I would say. And I want to thank you all for those last remarks. I think it's a springboard for the actual breakout sessions that are going to happen. So I'd like to give a round of applause to our panelists here.